Hello and welcome back to Times of Change read through. We are now on chapter 4. Last chapter I believe was, was chapter 3, and Gwendolyn met Finn for the first time. Now we're going to move to chapter 4. I'm only going to do up to 5 chapters because the series hasn't done very well. But if you have watched this and you are interested, all the links to the book are down below, rest with all my other social media. So, should we get started with chapter 4? And this is The Battle. Rain hit through the open window. A flash of lightning lit up the house, and a crack of thunder shot the lodgings. Instantly, Gwendolyn woke up. She quickly sat up, startled, with ash stuck to her cheek and her lips stained dark red with wine. She looked out of the window, confused by what was going on. She watched the rain falling through the window, wetting her face. Panicked by the sudden wake-up, she jumped up and shut the window. She sat down on the edge of the bed and wiped her face, disgusted. She looked at her hand, then at the ashtray, realising she must have used the ashtray as a pillow as she passed out from her overindulgence. She grunted and walked over to the washbowl and cleaned herself up, ready for the day. But her head was spinning. She had drunk too much the night before. So hungover, she griped. Slowly she shuffled to bottle the last of her potions, and then she focused on herself, plastering on her makeup to hide how she looked and felt. Exhausted, she packed her bags with her deliveries and opened the front door. The rain was heavy and the storm was fierce. She sighed, pulling up her hood on her cloak. Why today? She asked herself, of all days. She ran to the shelter of her stable and loaded Shadow. She was far too hungover to even contemplate riding Shadow into town. She put on her reins and tried leading her to town, but even Shadow showed resilience to walking in the rain. Please, Shadow, she pulled, please move. It took some persistence, but eventually they were on their way to deliver. Out of character, Gwendolyn shuffled from house to house, clinging to Shadow for support. As she dropped off her deliveries, she kept her chat to a minimum, as she found it too painful to talk, and her mood sullen from her self-inflicted pain. One of the villagers joked, "Is your mood because of the Nimrod in town?" She only replied with a fake smile, "It's just a hangover. I just drank too much last night." And so she continued walking in the rain, getting wetter and wetter, listening to the raindrops bouncing off her hood. She cursed. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a high-pitched, squealing roar rumbled from the sky. Both Gwendolyn and Shadow paused. That was not thunder. She whispered to herself. Again, the same sound shook the sky. It was so loud the villagers ran from their homes, businesses, to see what was making the noise. Running through the golden fields turning to marsh in the heavy rain, Finn ran at full speed, trying to gain ground on the escaping griffin. Anyway, he noticed in the distance they were getting too close to the village. Finn paused, holding himself strong. He pulled out his crossbow, aiming at the creature's wings. He shot, a hit. The creature screamed but continued to fly towards the village. So Finn let loose his remaining bolts on the beast. Becoming desperate, he sighed as he noticed the griffin finally coming to land. Still, it was far too close to the village and its people. Finn ran as fast as he could in the sodden fields, but he gained on the creature. That's when he noticed the villagers, surprised at how they stood staring at him. "Run, Amanda!" he screamed at them. Temporarily distracted, the griffin took advantage and grabbed Finn by his shoulder, picking him up by his beak. Finn screamed as he stabbed at the creature, trying to pierce its eye. Without him Seeing the blood and jelly-like fluid gushed over him. He was successful. He struck the creature's eye, and Finn fell to the floor with a thud in an instant. He had no time to lose. The griffin was distracted, and he needed to strike. Blasting fire at the face, he ran under its underside and cut and slashed furiously. The creature screamed, trying to grab him. Meanwhile, Finn grabbed hold of the bolts in its wings and climbed on the creature's back. He ran, leaping in the air. Lightning flashed behind him, blinding the creature. Finn landed, sword pointed down. He forced all of his weight on the blade, forcing the sword's point into the creature's skull with a crack. After pushing people back to safety, Gwendolyn watched how he heroically slew the creature. She was so stunned she forgot about the rain, the storm, and even her hangover. And all she saw was him. Slowly catching his breath, she watched Finn crawl down the creature. As he limped towards her, she saw he was severely hurt, so she hurried to him. "Finn!" she shouted, letting him know she was coming. Before she reached him, he collapsed to his knees. She jumped down, skidding in the mud towards him. She grabbed his face, holding him up. "I don't feel so good." He collapsed on top of her, his breathing shallow. She gritted her teeth as she cursed. She took hold of Finn, pulling his arm around her shoulders, lifting him. She looked behind herself. "Shadow!" she shouted over the storm. Almost instantly her horse came running towards her. With unbelievable strength, the villagers watched as Gwendolyn lift the man 3 times her size onto the tall horse. Daniel ran over to her. "Do you need help?" Gwendolyn jumped on her horse and threw down a basket of medicine. "This is for the villagers. Make sure the people get what they need. I don't know when I'm going to be back." She pushed her heels into her mare and rode off back to her wooden lodge. Soon behind her rode the Nimrod's horse, Shuck, following in tow. As Gwendolyn raced through the storm, the rain hit hard against her face, like needles against her skin. The tempest roared on, making the plight so much harder. Soaked through, Shadow struggled with the dirt path leading to Gwendolyn's wooden lodgings. The ground was saturated, and the combined weight of all 3 of them, they quickly sunk into the sludgy mud. Gwendolyn gritted her teeth in frustration. "Come on, Shadow, we're almost there." Finn's horse suddenly ran ahead of them, as if showing Shadow where to go, offering encouragement. Slowly they made their way to the house, but Gwendolyn had no time to relax. Shadow first stopped by the entrance of the house. Quickly she jumped off. Grabbing hold of Finn, she locked her arms under his arms and slowly backed up, pulling him from Shadow. She walked up the 2 flights of stairs of the porch, but unsupported, his feet came crashing down from the tall horse. Even in his unconscious state, he let out a cry. She pulled him flat on the porch and prayed she hadn't broken any bones in his feet. Quickly she removed all of his armour, weapons and clothing. The rain had mixed with his blood, saturating everything red. She had no idea how bad or not his blood loss was. Gwendolyn ran to her house, and while shivering from the rain, she started the fire and lit as many candles as she could find to make her home as bright as possible. She then ran to a chest that sat at the foot of her bed and began pulling out a bountiful amount of white bed sheeting. 1 near the fire, 1 near the bed, 1 out on the porch next to naked, shivering Nimrod. The horses watched her every movement, grunting and cursing. She ran past them, slodging through the mud to open the stable doors. She had no time to herd them into the stable, but she prayed by opening the stable door, Shadow would lead Shuck into the safety and out of the rain. As she slodged through the heavy mud, now caking her skirt, it was becoming almost too heavy to move. She gritted her teeth and powered through. Seeing Finn lying naked and shivering on the porch was enough motivation to keep her moving. She reached for him. His blood flowed freely around him on the wooden floor. Quickly she rolled him onto the sheet, making sure he was central as possible. Pulling to his feet, she bunched up the sheeting and dragged him to the river. As she turned to face the river, with her arm outstretched behind herself, she saw the horses had left. It gave her a faint sense of relief. At least the horses were out of the rain and safe. Good girl, she thought. The thunder cracked overhead, and she jumped at the closeness of the storm. Rain fell on her even faster and harder. She roared, pulling Finn through the mud towards the river. Her dress and shoes now caked in the mud that she could barely move, but she needed to clean him. She couldn't heal him covered in blood. Finally, she was close enough to the river. Grabbing a sponge she had placed under his head, she quickly wiped away as much blood as possible from his wounds. Cleaning the sponge in the foaming, roaring river, she was becoming overwhelmed, checking his body for injuries. "You cur," she cursed at him, as if he could hear her. "Why didn't you wait?" She said, worried about the poisoning that had now turned into affection. "How am I meant to treat this now?" She cleaned him as much as possible. In the rain and mud, Gwendolyn threw her sponge to the ground and ran as quick as she could in the sticking mud to his head. As before, grabbing the sheeting, she pulled him back to the porch. Slipping a couple of times, she fell to the mud. Still, Gwendolyn could not stop, and she just pulled herself up and carried on. Once Gwendolyn had pulled Finn from the porch near the entrance of the open doorway, she pulled off her muddy skirt and boots, trying to stay as clean as possible. Gwendolyn was sure she wasn't immaculate, but she could not see any mud on her hands, so she continued. Again, Gwendolyn pulled her arms underneath his arms, and she pulled him into the clean, warm sheet next to the fire. She kicked the dirty sheet from the porch and slammed the front door shut. With her back against the door, Gwendolyn briefly stood still and looked at him. Catching a breath, she tried to calm herself, ready to operate. With a deep sigh, she quickly patted him as dry as she could with the sheet, and once again she dragged him towards the bed, pulling the bed into the centre of the room to act as an operating table. Feeling exhaustion creeping into her body, Gwendolyn dragged Finn onto the bed with incredible difficulty. She panted, looking down at him. "You are surprisingly heavy," she whispered breathlessly. She pulled back her soaking wet hair from her face and pulled it up with a long red silk ribbon lying on her workbench. She pulled over a small table and loaded it with everything she could need to fight this poisoned infection. She looked down at his forearm, which looked much worse in the light. The veins around his wound were now turning black, and as she opened the laceration to look inside, green pus oozed out, the smell alone was sickening. She ran to her drinks cabinet and pulled out a large bottle of gin she had been saving for a special day, and she felt it was a shame to use it as a disinfectant, but Finn's life was far more important. Quickly she poured the spirit liberally over his wound until the pus had all gone. She briefly looked at his face. No reaction. Good, she thought. He shouldn't be awake for this. It would only make it harder. She saw the culprit of the infection, tiny black hairs laid embedded in his wound. Not hair from a human or an animal, but hairs from the stinger of a bittler. Gwendolyn slowly and carefully pulled each individual hair out with tweezers and carefully placed the hairs in a bucket by her feet. She tried to remain calm and focused, because if she unfortunately managed to drop just one hair on her skin, she just imagined it would have dire consequences, as she did not possess the same immunity as that of a Nimrod. Over an hour later of painstaking work, and she stood up straight, straightening her back until she heard a loud crack. She gave a slight moan, rubbing her lower back as she realised it was quiet. The storm had finally passed. She was so deep in concentration she had not even noticed. However, her work was not yet over. She still had much to do to fix up the battered Nimrod. She rushed to alchemic work desk and quickly began opening all of the drawers until she found a syringe and needle. Again, she splashed the gin over the needle and she sprinkled the wound once more, and then took a hearty drag from the bottle herself. It was a little bit rolled down her chin in her haste. She wiped her chin with the back of her arm and continued working. She looked at the glass vial containing a yellow-hued liquid. She bit at her lower lip nervously, as she knew the gan lib was meant to be drunk soon after poisoning, but it was all that she had. However, she thought it looked like his body was fighting the poison well. It appeared to be the infection that was far more the problem. She injected him with the gan lib just to be safe, and then poured the thick, creamy honey into his wound. Gwendolyn finished by wrapping up his arm in a bandage, thankful now for the whole cupboard of bandages in her possession. She wondered when she would ever have such a need for so many bandages when once a passing merchant gave them to her. However, they were given to her for no payment, so Gwendolyn did not complain. She smiled to herself. Funny how destiny has a way of working out, she thought to herself. She sighed and placed her hands on her hips. Then she looked over Finn's next most significant wound. She breathed a sigh of relief, seeing that there was much less blood on the sheet below him. Thank the gods you are not a normal man, she whispered to herself. Next was a bite mark from the griffin when it picked Finn up in its beak. She felt around it to make sure nothing was broken. Yes, a much easier job, she thought. She needed a break. Her work was almost done, and she just had to walk around and stand straight out of her bent-over standing position. She walked outside to fetch Finn's sword and various other weapons. She laid them up against the wall near the fireplace, trying to dry them, as she knew the Nimrod prides themselves on their weaponry, so she did not want Finn to wake to rusted tools of his trade. As Gwendolyn moved back to his side, she could now concentrate a little less on his wounds. She looked over Finn's body in detail, at all the scars, the deep and thick ones that ran across his chest, his arms, and his stomach, and across his legs. She gently ran her hand over the scar on his arm, looking at him pained. I too know what it feels like to be cut this deep, to scar like this, she whispered as if he could hear her. She moved her fingertips softly across his hand, analysing the details of his spell-tattooed skin. Fascinating, she whispered. She knew all about the spells Nimrod's cast, and how they had a different tattoo for each spell. She wasn't sure why it interested her, but it honestly did. She stood up straight and gave a slight nod. Shall we continue? She laughed at herself and set straight back to work. She continued her work of disinfecting, stitching and bandaging his wounds. She found several large wounds on his body and continued with the same treatment. The rest were abrasions and minor cuts. She just wiped these clean, and once she had finished, she looked out of the window, surprised to see it was a new day. She then knew why she had felt so exhausted. She removed the bloody sheet beneath him and pulled him under the bed covers, trying to make him as comfortable as possible. She found it a little funny how he was almost entirely wrapped up in bandages. As she pulled the hair from his face, she then noticed how pale he had become. She briefly pulled back his sheets to look at his upper body, and his skin was so white his veins were ghostly blue underneath his skin. She began to panic a little. Although she was near to collapsing with exhaustion after working on treating all of his injuries for so many hours, she still had one thing left to do. You need blood, she whispered to herself. She returned to her alchemic desk, and she rummaged through her drawers of oddities and pulled out a queer-looking device with 2 tubes and attached 2 needles, and at the opposite end of the 2 rubber tubes, all connected to a large bottle. Gwendolyn placed the device on her bedside table, also along with a bottle of gin. She lit a candle with a tapir and moved the ashtray along with the pipe filled with tobacco, already waiting to be smoked, all on the table next to the armchair. She placed the needle first into Finn's arm. She took a big swig of gin straight from the bottle and sat down. She pushed the needle from the device into her own arm. She plunged the lever on top of the large bottle through a couple of times to pressurize the bottle. Slowly the blood from the tube in her arm began to pour into the glass bottle. Feeling incredibly faint, Gwendolyn lit her pipe and stared into space as the jar filled with her blood. She didn't know if it was blood loss, exhaustion, or both, but she couldn't handle it anymore. She took a couple of long, deep breaths from her pipe, sat it down in the ashtray, and looked at the glass bottle. It filled almost 3/4 of the way. It must have been roughly 3 pints. It will do, she thought. She pumped the lever once again, and the blood began to flow up the tube into Finn's arm. I did it, she breathed. Her vision became dark, and her head began to spin. She sat back in the armchair and looked at the mess of the night that just passed. I will just rest for... She passed out before she could even finish her thought. Gwendolyn awoke and was surprised to see it was still daylight, but she had no idea if the day had passed or it was just later that day. However, it did not matter to her. Gwendolyn slowly stood up and just looked about the house, still a little woozy from the blood transfusion. It was a mess, and one thing Gwendolyn could not stand was a messy home. She rubbed her eyes and stretched, forgetting she was still had the needle in her arm. She let out a screech and quickly pulled the needle from her arm. She then looked at where the needle had come from and rubbed it. Ow! She said, removing the needle from Finn's arm, and pulled back the sheets, gave him a quick look over. The colour in his skin had returned. There was slight blood loss on a few bandages, but she thought she would clean up first and deal with his bandages later. She tucked him up in the sheets and walked outside. She cursed. The mess was just as disarray outside as it was in. Even she was a mess, walking around in her underwear, but fully dressed from the waist up. She ran her fingers through her hair and gave a loud sigh. "I can't deal with this right now," she muttered to herself. Refilling her pipe and pouring herself a large glass of wine, she sat on the muddy steps of the porch, staring at the churned-up grass from dragging Finn around. She stared at the once raging river, now back to being calm and serene. She took a deep breath from her pipe and looked about at all of the clothing to be washed. She took a long sip of wine. "I shall do that first," she whispered to herself. Once she had finished her pipe, her glass of wine, she stood up and got to work. As she said to herself, she began washing the entirety of the clothing first, and washing Finn's gear was no easy feat. Covered in years of blood, sweat, and everything in between. "Does he ever clean?" she grumbled to herself. And then, out of nowhere, she remembered. He had a thick, overgrown beard when they first met, but now he was clean-shaven before his battle with the griffin. Gwendolyn blushed a little. Did he shave for me? She wondered. She shook her head, feeling silly. No, of course not. He probably just prefers to be clean-shaven. Gwendolyn became angry with herself. Lottie is right. I'm too old to be thinking like this, she continued to think. She sighed and hung all of the clean clothing on the line. She smiled to herself, proud of herself for getting out all the stains, but she had nowhere to put Finn's armour. Daniel has an old stand with armour back at the inn. Hopefully he'll let me borrow that. For now, Gwendolyn left it all together on the porch. As she finished cleaning outside, she figured the horses would be okay for a couple of days to be left alone. So she began to clean the house, tools and mop the floor, pack away the potions. She got on with her chores, and before she knew it, it was night again. Finally, she'd earned her break. So, as she did in the morning, she sat on the now clean porch with a pipe, large glass of red wine, inhaling deeply. She stared at the clear, starry sky. This is my fault, she thought to herself. I wanted something different. I wanted something exciting. I wanted something new. She took another deep breath of her tobacco and sipped her wine. I sure got what I asked for, didn't I? She sat listening to the night, the cricket and the owls. She closed her eyes. What on the isles will tomorrow bring? Gradually from the shadows she heard a voice she knew all too well, but one she had not heard for a very long time. An inhuman voice, a voice not designed for comfort. She felt as its hot, clammy breath on her shoulder, but she did not turn her head to face it. Gwendolyn, I'm still here, it breathed, like it was painful to talk. She gritted her teeth, her voice cold, her personality changed to something darker. I did not summon you. How dare you present yourself without permission? The creature gave a whispery, husky laugh as it moved closer, almost hugging her back. It drew its lipless mouth to her ear. She watched as its hot breath blew past her face. It smelt like death. You like the Nimrod? You want to taste him? She spun around and looked at the creature in the eye. Most would run from fear that sat before her, but not everyone was like Gwendolyn. It was possible no woman alive was like Gwendolyn. Her eyes glowed a magical blue, and she panted in anger. How dare you? You are my minion. You do as I say. Leave now, before you regret what you have said. The creature laughed again, slowly backing and disappearing back into the shadows, its voice lingering. I only warn you, Gwen. He will kill you. Gwendolyn did not like this. She had not seen or spoken to her demon in 10 years, ever since they closed the portal to Searle's laboratory. Panicked worries suddenly bombarded her mind. She worried her demon's presence would alert the mage to her location. She was concerned the Nimrod in her bed would kill her. She worried her once peaceful life was about to end. Her heartbeat was so fast she began to shake. She dropped the pipe, the glass of wine with her widened eyes, and ran inside the home, slamming the door shut. She held her hand up against the door, breathing heavily. She let her head fall between her arms. I will not go back to you, Searle, she whispered. Her eyes flared a bright ice blue shining from the dark hair. I will not. Slowly she moved her head to look at Finn. Her eyes narrowed and her jaw tightened. She stood up, straightening, allowing her arms to drop to her side. She stood up and stared at Finn's unconscious body. Will you kill me, Nimrod? She said softly. Her demeanour changed. She turned into something threatening, something primal. Her fierce expression hardened her soft face. She stood above Finn, looking down at him lying unconscious on the bed. You will not fight me like the last Nimrod. She looked over at his swords, propped against the wall. Gwendolyn looked back at his face. Why now? Why else would my demons come calling if you weren't going to kill me? She gritted her teeth, and in one inhumanly fast, swift movement, she grabbed the sword and sheathed it and held the blade above his chest. She trembled, drawing the blade a mere hair's thickness from his heart. She remembered the last time she stood like this. She remembered the last time she held a sword above the Nimrod's heart. She clenched the hilt of the sword with both hands, her knuckles turning white. She breathed deeper, feeling tears fill her eyes. She remembered the monster she once was. She remembered the weight of a Nimrod's sword. She remembered the feeling of pushing the blade into her living body. Gwendolyn shook more violently as the past swirled into her mind. She couldn't do it. Gwendolyn had not known this man for long, but she did not feel he was an evil man. She could not kill a man as he slept, even if he was a bad person. She moved the sword away from him. She sheathed the sword and collapsed in the armchair, looking at his relaxed, unconscious face. If I am to die by your blade, so be it. Gwendolyn held her head in her hands, shaking her head. Gods, why did I ask for this? And that is the end of chapter 4. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you're enthralled and wish to hear or read more. As I didn't release chapter 4 last week, that will be released sometime. Well, no, you're going to know because you'll be watching this. So it's pointless me saying this. Never mind. I hope you enjoyed. Like, subscribe. If you're interested in the series, the book, that is, the link is down below. And all my social media is in the link down below if you want to look at all my other content. So I hope I see you tomorrow for chapter 5. Bye.